Somewhere in the deep past, a mother presses the back of her hand against her child's forehead. She has no word for what she's checking, no number to compare it to, no memory of ever seeing a number in her entire life. And yet, in that single instant, she knows something is wrong. Her hand has just performed one of the oldest diagnostic procedures our species has ever practiced, thousands of years before anyone had the faintest idea what a degree was. Here's a question that sounds almost too simple to be interesting. How did ancient humans know when someone had a fever? We take it for granted today, a beep, a number, a little screen, but for more than 99% of human history, none of that existed. No thermometer, no Celsius, no Fahrenheit. So how do you diagnose something invisible, using nothing but your own senses? The answer turns out to be one of the oldest, quietly brilliant pieces of applied science our species ever developed. And it happened, independently, over and over again, in civilizations that never once spoke to each other. Let's start with what's actually happening inside a feverish body, because it explains everything that follows. Fever isn't your body malfunctioning. It's your body doing something deliberate. Deep in the brain, a small structure called the hypothalamus quietly resets your internal thermostat upward in response to signals released during infection. Your body isn't losing control of its temperature, it's choosing a higher one. And here's the part that might surprise you. This trick is almost absurdly old. Scientists have watched infected lizards, fish, and even insects deliberately move toward warmer spots to raise their own body temperature when they're sick. Fever, in some form, may be older than mammals, older than dinosaurs, arguably. Long before humans existed to name it, evolution had already figured out that heat helps fight infection. So if nobody had thermometers, how did ancient people actually catch it? With the only tool they had, their own bodies. A hand on the forehead, lips pressed briefly to warm skin. The specific, unmistakable heat of a sick person's torso compared to a healthy one. Flushed cheeks, sweat that won't stop, or a shiver that won't quit. Confusion, exhaustion, a child who suddenly won't eat. None of that requires a single piece of technology. It requires only something ancient humans had in abundance. Decades of accumulated, shared pattern recognition. Passed down the same way fire starting and hunting knowledge were passed down. By watching, by doing, by teaching the next generation. And here's a small, oddly moving detail. That same forehead touch gesture, parent to child, shows up today in cultures that have had no contact with each other for tens of thousands of years. Anthropologists see that kind of universal, technology-free gesture as a strong hint of real antiquity, even though, frustratingly, a hand on a forehead leaves no fossil behind. Eventually, some cultures started writing what they'd observed, and that's where the story gets its first hard evidence. In Egypt, a medical document called the Ebers Papyrus, compiled around 1550 BCE from material likely far older, describes feverish illness alongside treatments. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets more than 4,000 years old describe symptoms we'd instantly recognize as fever today, even while blaming them on demons or angry gods rather than biology. That combination is worth sitting with for a second. Remarkably accurate observation wrapped in a completely different explanation of why it was happening. They were excellent diagnosticians and, by modern standards, incorrect physiologists, and there's nothing embarrassing about that. They were working entirely from what they could see, touch, and track across thousands of patients over generations. In ancient Greece, a physician named Hippocrates took that observation a step further. He developed the idea that fever reflected an imbalance among the body's core fluids, blood, phlegm, and two kinds of bile. Wrong by modern medicine. But here's the genuinely impressive part. Hippocratic physicians also noticed that fevers tended to peak and break on fairly predictable days during an illness, what they called critical days. That's not guesswork. That's the result of careful, repeated clinical observation across an enormous number of patients, distilled into a working pattern centuries before anyone understood immunology. Here's where the story gets a little uncanny. On the other side of the world, with zero contact with Greece, Egypt, or Mesopotamia, ancient Indian physicians compiling the Charaka Samhita were independently building an extraordinarily detailed system for classifying fever, calling it Jwara. At roughly the same time, ancient Chinese medical texts like the Huangdi Neijing were doing something remarkably similar. Different continents, different languages, different explanatory frameworks entirely, and yet the same basic conclusion arrived at independently. Fever is real, it's recognizable, it has patterns, and it's worth taking seriously. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when careful observation of the same biological reality happens again and again, in isolation, across the human species. Now here's a discovery that quietly connects the ancient world to your medicine cabinet. Long before anyone knew what a molecule was, multiple completely separate cultures, Sumerians, Egyptians, and later the Greeks, arrived at the same treatment for fever and pain: willow bark. Sumerian tablets mention it, the Ebers Papyrus mentions it, Hippocrates specifically recommended willow leaf tea. It turns out willow bark contains a compound called salicin, chemically related to the active ingredient in modern aspirin. These civilizations had, through nothing but trial, error, and generations of shared observation, identified a genuinely effective remedy thousands of years before anyone could explain why it worked. And the story might go back even further than written history. At a site called El Cidrón in Spain, researchers examined the hardened dental plaque of Neanderthal remains and found chemical traces consistent with poplar, which, like willow, contains salicin, and possibly chamomile, a plant long used to ease discomfort. Some researchers think this could be evidence of Neanderthals self-medicating for pain or illness. Others are more cautious, pointing out the same residue could simply reflect ordinary diet. The debate isn't settled, but the possibility alone is enough to make you look at Neanderthals a little differently. Not brutish, but potentially chemists of a sort, curating their own natural pharmacy tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote anything down. For all of that accumulated knowledge, spanning Egypt, Greece, India, China, and possibly even Neanderthals, one thing stayed constant for an almost unbelievably long time. Fever was still something you felt, not something you measured. That finally changed in 1612, when an Italian physician named Santorio built one of the first workable thermometers. But even then, it was clumsy and rare, not something used in everyday medicine. The real turning point didn't come until 1868, shockingly recent, when a German physician named Karl Wunderlich took temperature readings from tens of thousands of patients and established something we still use today: the idea of a normal, average human temperature, and a number that marks the line into fever. Which means, for a species that's existed for roughly 300,000 years, we've only actually had a number for fever for about 150 of them. It's tempting to imagine ancient healers as guessing in the dark. The evidence says otherwise. They built independent, working systems for recognizing a completely invisible biological process, using nothing but touch, patience, and generations of shared observation. They identified effective treatments centuries before understanding the chemistry behind them. They noticed patterns precise enough to predict when an illness would likely turn. That's not primitive. That's science, running on the only instruments available: human senses, human memory, and human care for each other. Next time someone checks your forehead with the back of their hand before reaching for a thermometer, notice it. That gesture is older than written language, older, quite possibly, than our own species. Long before anyone had a number for it, someone, somewhere, learned to feel the difference between well and unwell and cared enough to check.